Hey, Story of Scripture in a Year friends. I'm so excited to jump into our first week of June together. We're going to be taking a look at 2 Kings, chapters 4 through 18 in the Old Testament. And then the New Testament, we're going to take a look at John chapters 9 through chapter 12, particularly verse 19. As is normal, I try to pick kind of one big theological idea, thought, or story from the text to expound on it. There's so much that's going on in these passages of Scripture. The thing that I want to actually focus on is this interesting marriage between these two individuals, Ahab and Jezebel. And there are certain words and certain phrases in our society that almost transcend the biblical cultural context, and they just become kind of everyday language and vernacular, and we lose the roots of where these words or these phrases come from. And an interesting detail is that I think the name or the phrase Jezebel, and the phrase is Jezebel spirit, is something that's widely used today. And some people may not even know where it comes from. They just have the sense of, hey, this is a very negative connotation to it. And so where we find this is actually right here in these chapters and these verses of Scripture that we're studying today in 2 Kings, chapters 4 through 18, specifically in the story of Jezebel's death. And so what I want to do is I want to actually unpack this big question. Is the phrase the Jezebel spirit biblical or not? So for today, I want to take a look at this story. I want to take a look at this woman, and then the phrase that we've begun to use and whether or not it's an appropriate way. And the goal here is to kind of talk about our biblical theological method. How precise are we? Just because we can coin something a certain way, the question is, should we? What is the impact of us doing such things? And so the story of Ahab and Jezebel shows up in both 1st and 2nd Kings. Particularly by the time you get into 2nd Kings, we actually find that Jezebel is killed. So, her husband, there's all kinds of wild things that kind of happen with her husband. But by the time we get to, I'm flipping to it, by the time we get to 2 Kings chapter 9, we get Jehu, who kills Jezebel. And this is the end of a story that is kind of wild. So let's just kind of unpack the story of Jezebel, but particularly where we find this word and this woman and how it's used. And so the name Jezebel, in fact, shows up in two places in Scripture, in 1 Kings 16:31, and obviously also in 2 Kings, like I just described, and also in Revelation 2:20. Now, Revelation 2:20, and remember we kind of are talking about as we look through the story of Scripture in a year that there's this one cohesive story, that there is narrative connections between the Old and New Testament, and we start to see some of this in the book of Revelation as we look at a New Testament passage of Scripture that is echoing back, recalling an Old Testament passage. And so you have Revelation 2:20. And in Revelation 2:20, the word or the phrase is used as an indictment against the church in Thyatira, who followed the ways of a false teacher, a prophetess, and this individual is cast as a Jezebel. So the point of Revelation 2:20 is to draw back actually to another story, an ancient story of Jezebel, Ahab, and Elijah. And we find these in 1st and 2nd Kings to draw a connection to the type of evil that was present in Thyatira. Now, we never find the phrase Jezebel spirit in Scripture to describe a specific malevolent evil spirit. However, there is enough biblical evidence to suggest that there is a type of evil spiritual strategy that is directly connected to the type of activities that were taking place with the historical Jezebel. And then the recasting of this name in Revelation 2:20 tells us that this is something that we have to take really seriously. So let's explore some of the details around the historical Jezebel, and then we'll look at Revelation 2:20, and then let's come to a conclusion. Is the Jezebel spirit actually biblical? So the historical Jezebel. In 1 Kings 16:31, we're introduced to a woman who marries Ahab, and her name is Jezebel. It says this, that Ahab then proceeded to serve Baal and bow in worship to him. So interesting detail, Baal or Baal is a Canaanite deity, a Canaanite god. He was the god of thunder, the god of the storms. And so here we have a specific name that is associated with a specific type of deity. So we can say that, like, yeah, there is a god named Baal, a false god named Baal. Do we have the same for Jezebel? Is there a actual malevolent evil spirit that is given the name as Jezebel, in the same way that you would have Ishtar, or that you have Molech, or you have Dagon? Is that present in the biblical text? So let's just keep exploring. And it says this in 1 Kings 21:25, we're told that Ahab devoted himself to do evil because of his wife Jezebel, who incited him. This is 1 Kings 16:31 and then 21:25. We're even told that Jezebel was the source of various prostitution and sorcery. This is 2 Kings 9:22, what we're reading today. Now, you can start to determine, well, where we're getting this idea of a Jezebel spirit and how it's associated with prostitution and kind of loose women and this whole kind of idea. Now, all of this tells us that there is a direct connection with Jezebel and idol worship. There's no doubt about that. These gods of the nations, such as Baal, are not non-existent. They very much exist, but they're false gods. They are masquerading around as the one true God. They are rebellious angels. See Deuteronomy 32:8-9, Psalm 82, who are real malevolent spiritual beings. The connection with Jezebel here, with sorcery and prostitution, is very important, as it draws the connection to Revelation 2:20, and why John, while he's in exile in Patmos, would draw us to this name to describe this prophetess in Thyatira. So let's get to Revelation 2:20 now, right? So look at the indictment against this prophetess in the city of Thyatira. She's a deceiver who encourages sexual immorality and idolatry. Does this sound familiar? Yes, these were the actions of the historical Jezebel. So here, John is recasting this figure to help us make a connection with a situation that already took place in the history of God's people. These dark practices and evil ways are detestable to God. The city of Thyatira was actually an economic hub where trade was incredibly prosperous, and the city had guilds for different types of trades, and each of these trades had patron deities, and they paid homage for protection and provision. And so the culture of Thyatira was primed for idol worship, especially since it was connected to the economic flourishing of the city. A perfect place for a prophetess, quote unquote Jezebel, to work her deception and seduction. All right. Can we say that there is a specific Jezebel spirit in terms of a malevolent spirit? My answer would be, in terms of theological precision, no. There does not seem to be any biblical evidence to cast some demonic figure as the Jezebel spirit. With that said, should we use the phrase Jezebel spirit in any other context? My answer would be yes. There is a direct connection between evil spiritual practices, including perverted sexuality and seduction and other forms of illicit sexualized activity, that is directly connected to demonic activity. This is exactly what John in Patmos connects the evil prophetess of Thyatira as a Jezebel, to connect the ancient story in Kings, to remind us that this activity and strategy is still present today. We need to be aware of that. We need to reject this kind of evil and seek after the Spirit of God to encourage, equip, and to empower us for godliness. But I want us to have a significant caution. I think the words and the phrases that we use are important. Hey, Humble Theology fam. It's kind of wild, but I wrote my very first book and it released earlier this year. It's called The Hidden Peace. Here it is right here. Finding true security, strength, and confidence through humility. Really what I wanted to do was write a book that was accessible for the everyday average Bible reader, but gave you some sound biblical theology on the ancient virtue of humility, which was in fact the very virtue that sustained and helped the first century church to thrive and flourish. And this was all based around Philippians 2:8-9, the idea that Jesus himself really exampled for us and modeled for us divine humility. And so the book is available right now. If you've ever felt anxious, if you are worried about what other people feel or look about you, I mean, if you've had any type of insecurities really at all in your life and it has robbed you of peace, the secret to the peace that you've been longing for is this ancient virtue that has for far too long been neglected, the virtue of humility. The Hidden Peace is available on Amazon and all the major book retailers where you would normally normally get it. You can also get a copy from Proverbs 31 Ministries, the P31 bookstore, which is where I serve as Director of Theology. And I'll have a link in the show notes for you as well. I pray that this book would be an encouragement for you as you grow and you learn how to cultivate the soil of humility, which is in fact the soil in which all the fruit of the Spirit of Galatians 5 flow from. Blessings to you, friends. And so I'm personally hesitant to brand a concept with an official phrase like the Jezebel spirit, because it can put too much focus and emphasis on these dark powers. Further, if the scriptures themselves and other Second Temple literature and the traditional interpretation don't seem to utilize this type of language in any official or intentional capacity, I think it is reason for us to use caution. For example, I think it's important that we use biblical terms for biblical ideas. Paul's language for dark powers are powers, principalities, authorities, and dominions, or thrones that invade systems and structures in order to corrupt them. The Bible does speak of evil spirits, unclean spirits, and demons in categorical terms. We do have some evidence of specific names for these beings, like the example of the demoniac, the legion, or the desert demon, Azazel, or even Beelzebub, identified as the prince of demons. In these situations, we have an explicit reference. Frankly, we just don't have that for the Jezebel spirit, which leads me to be cautious of over-symbolizing. Additionally, I've heard at times reference to the Jezebel spirit or Ahab spirit or spirit of Elijah as things we as believers have to pursue or should reject. For example, we should reject the Jezebel spirit and the spirit of Ahab and instead take on and pursue the spirit of Elijah. I understand the sentiment of this. I also believe we should use caution with this as well. We don't need the spirit of Elijah. We need the spirit of God that led Elijah. We don't need to simply reject the Jezebel and Ahab spirit. We need to wholeheartedly reject and deny every malevolent spirit coming against God, his kingdom, and his people. And so we find all of this in this passage in 2 Kings as we're working through the text. Okay, in the New Testament, we're going to look at the Gospel of John. And specifically, we're going to look at John chapter 9, where there's the story, as Jesus is walking by, he meets a man who is blind. And the disciples have a real question. They're trying to figure out, why is it that this man is blind? And specifically, they're trying to figure out, like, who is at fault, right? So here's what the text says. The text says, as he was passing by, so Jesus, as he was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. So the details are important. Here's an individual. He's been blind from birth. And his disciples ask him, Rabbi, teacher, who sinned? So already we know that in the framework, in the worldview of the disciples, they instantly see blindness connected to some type of sin. This is not the action of somebody who is innocent. And so they go, there's only two answers. Either the man sinned or his parents. Otherwise, why else would he be born blind? Look what Jesus says. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Jesus answered, this came about so that God's work might be displayed in him. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night's coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And after he said these things, he spit on the ground, made some mud from the saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means to be sent. Kind of interesting. Jesus is the one sending him. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. Now, I want to make a little note here that what Jesus does is something that is descriptive for us, not prescriptive for us. So just in case any of you are like, man, I think that I'm supposed to be helping to heal people who are blind, and I'm going to go spit in some mud and put it on a blind man's face. Don't do that. Please don't do that. This is descriptive what Jesus incarnate, God incarnate is doing. And so the interesting thing is what happens with the man, that he begins to see everybody in the city are like, wait a minute, we know you're the dude who's been blind since birth so clearly. So what is the biggest kind of bigger idea here? That sometimes you and I want answers for the why of the difficulty and the hardship and the heartache of our lives. And the reality is that while we might want to know the answer for the why, the reality is that that is the way it is. And we can get all the answers in the world. The more answers we get, the more questions we're going to end up having. And here's the simplest answer, that you and I live in a sin-soaked world. You and I live in the reality of a Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11 and 12 fallen world, And as a result of that, because of the fundamental brokenness of humanity and all of creation, there are some really hard and even horrific things that take place in this earth and in our lives. And what Jesus does is he shows us that though this might be true for a moment, it will not be true forever. That Jesus is not just working, he has worked on the cross in order to upend, to deal with the deep rootedness of the evil of this world, and the fullness of that will come when he returns, not as suffering servant, but as conquering king. I hope you've enjoyed. As always, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. So many of you watch and you enjoy the videos, but you're not subscribed, so you might miss new content. I'd love for you to subscribe. And if you're listening on podcasts, on the Theology Talk podcast, on Spotify, or on Apple, do the same. Give us a follow. And then also for everybody, give us a review, like on the podcast store, and let us know how this is doing. It will help with visibility and to let more people know about the content and the biblical teaching. I appreciate y'all. We'll see y'all next time. Bye.